Isn't it great to see such a fiery presentation? Our next speaker, I've known for like forever. Representative Itse and I served in the House together for many, many years. And when I wanted to look up a piece of legislation that he sponsored, there's a capability of doing a search of legislation. And the best way to do it is to put the rep's name. So I put in Itse. And I got about 500 bills that he'd sponsored. And I had to go through every one of them looking for the one that I was searching for. So I have to tell you, he has been one of the strongest advocates for children, for family law, for the Constitution that I've ever worked with. And so I am very proud to introduce my colleague, the Honorable Dan Itse. There's a step over here.
Lest you think I'm being a little self-aggrandizing there with that introductory music, I want to tell you why I chose that. Not only is it a great flick, The Patriot, and it shows some historical facts, but it was also Jared's favorite movie. So as I'm standing here before you today, I want you to think of the battle flag rushing up from the back of the column. I'm here today to introduce you to the Regulation Freedom Amendment, and it's important that you understand that this is not introducing a new restraint upon Congress. It is an attempt to make explicit in our Constitution an idea that is already there implicit. It is a concept so inherent to our form of government that if you had suggested this language in 1787, they would have suspected that you might be illiterate, or at the very least, you were a few cards short of a full deck. Delegating the power of making law to unelected bureaucrats violates the non-delegation doctrine. And yes, that is a real thing. In John Locke's second treatise on government, in the chapter of the extent of legislative power, Locke concludes with the non-delegation doctrine. Quote, "The legislative cannot transfer the power of making laws to any other hands, for it being but a delegated power from the people, they who have it cannot pass it to others." Again, the power of the legislative being derived from the people by a positive, voluntary grant and institution can be no other than what that positive grant conveyed, which being only to make laws and not to make legislators. The legislative can have no power to transfer authority of making laws and place it in other hands. And in the last paragraph, the legislative neither must nor can transfer the power of making laws to anybody else or place it anywhere, but where the people have. And this applies to our state as well as the general government. Now you may ask, what does Locke have to do with our constitutions? He was an Englishman, right? From 100 years before. Well, for the 30 years prior to the War for Independence, John Locke's second treatise was quoted from the pulpits of New England, and those sermons were republished throughout the colonies. After an American edition of the second treatise was published in Boston in 1773, Samuel Adams, often regarded as the father of our War for Independence, said in a newspaper article, quote, "Early and carefully it ought to be, quote, early and carefully explained by every father to his son, by every preceptor in our public and private schools to his pupils, and by every mother to her daughter." They thought it was important. Our Declaration of Independence is premised upon Locke's theory on natural rights, that certain actions by a monarch constitute a state of war by the monarch against his subjects, placing them in a state of nature, justifying a plea to heaven and the right to establish a new government of their own design and to which they consent. But it is in fact patterned after an earlier document, the English Bill of Rights, which Locke himself wrote in 1689. It is almost as though they were written by the same author. In fact, some of the indictments against King George in 1776 are the same or paraphrases of the indictments against King James in 1689. They made a similar appeal to heaven, and they laid the same right to establish a new government of their own choosing. These arguments are laid out in New Hampshire's first constitution, January 5th, 1776, that the king was waging war against the people of New Hampshire, and Governor Wentworth had abandoned the colony, leaving them without royal authority. There was no vehicle to establish laws and no courts in which to try lawbreakers. They found themselves in a state of nature, reduced to having to establish a form of government. The same concepts are in our current state constitution in the Bill of Rights, Article 10. But there's one notable difference between the English Bill of Rights and our Declaration. The English Bill of Rights explicitly prohibits civil forfeiture without conviction. So, what is that positive grant of power that Locke spoke of in our federal Constitution? It's actually the first 25 operative words in the Constitution after the preamble. It's Article 1, Section 1. All legislative power herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Doesn't say most, doesn't say except for rules. There are no exceptions, no equivocations. All legislative power is granted herein. No lawmaking power, or what we so blithely call the making of rules with the force of law, can lawfully be delegated to any other branch of government. Over the course of the 20th century, we've seen the growth of what we call the administrative state. The creation of departments and agencies performing functions, most of which were never intended to be part of our government. Legislators were convinced that these large organizations filled with thousands of people performing complex functions to innumerable individuals were beyond their comprehension. That the rules governing their interaction with the people needed to be crafted by the experts. And so they willingly, lazily forsook their duty of making laws. And besides, when challenged by a constituent, they can say, that's in rules, we don't control that. And in fact, the way they wrote the law, they don't. It would take a positive act to increase their workload. The result is that rules, which govern much of our daily lives, are enacted by unelected bureaucrats. If we don't like those laws, we are powerless to turn our oppressors out. It is truly laws without representation. The solution is to force Congress to take their power back. Now, this is going to be an easier push than, say, the balanced budget amendment, where you're taking power away from Congress. It shouldn't have to be done from outside by, say, the convention method. In fact, we are telling them to take their power back. And we know they love power. The Regulation Freedom Amendment is an attempt to restore power to Congress, which they have wrongfully and unlawfully delegated to the armies of bureaucrats. And the process is simple. Now, it's stated in reverse, but if it were to be enacted, it would require a supermajority of the legislature, each chamber, for a rule to be approved. A defined minority of legislators of either chamber can require any rule proposed to undergo the full legislative scrutiny, just as if it were a law. The suggested language is as follows. Whenever 1/4 of the members of the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate transmit to the President their written declaration of opposition to a proposed federal regulation, it shall require a majority vote of the House and Senate to adopt that regulation, close quote. Now, I was told I couldn't take any questions, but we're at the audience participation part. So, how many of you like the Regulation Freedom Amendment? Okay, now we've established that. It has popular support. The Regulation Freedom Amendment has been endorsed by the RNC with the approval of the White House, Vice President Mike Pence, Senator Ted Cruz, Senator David Perdue, Ed Meese. How many of you are willing to lobby Governor Sununu to get his endorsement for the Regulation Freedom Amendment? Sure. Okay, there we go. Thank you, Omar. Okay. How many of you are ready to work to elect a congressional delegation? Now, right now we have Senator Hassan, Senator Shaheen, and I don't even remember the names of the other two, but they're also Democrats. They aren't going to support this. How many of you are ready to work to elect a congressional delegation that supports the Regulation Freedom Amendment? Okay, when we're done, come out and visit our table, and I'll give you a few tools. Thank you. God bless you, and God bless the great state of New Hampshire. And I hope that someday we will again become one nation, indivisible, not by the force of arms, but by our love one for another. For so shall we be known.
Croc TV.